Well, good morning. It's good to see everybody. Good to see you over here at All Saints. And last week, we launched a new sermon series, which was quite impromptu because of our wandering in the wilderness. And so we launched a new series called Some of Life's Best Lessons. And what we've been doing is we've been looking at the Israelites, God's people, as they wandered in the wilderness. God had given them the promised land. It literally would have taken them 11 days to get there, and they wandered for 40 years. And so we feel like we're kind of a little bit of that. We've been praying it doesn't take 40 years. But some of the lessons God's been teaching me and teaching the staff and maybe even teaching some of you as we go through this process. And so last week we launched this with the lesson, it's not just about the destination, it's about the journey. And this morning, we're going to do another one of these lessons about fear. Now, if you were here earlier in the service when we put this out there in front of you, you guys did a great job. You know, the thing is, we all have innate fears about things. Like, right now, I'm willing to guess that there are a lot of you in this room who are afraid of clowns. Now's not a good time for you to be alive, right? With all this clown craziness going on. Some of you have a fear of public speaking. Some of my innate fears, I've shared these with you before. I have a fear of heights. It got worse when we moved over here. I have a fear of water. So you take me and put me up on a high place where there's nothing beneath me but water, you just do me in. I have a fear of snakes. They showed up early in the Bible. It wasn't good. It's gone downhill ever since. I don't like snakes. There's been a new fear that's come to the surface in my life over the last couple of weeks. Really, like, and it just in the last couple of weeks, I have this fear that Tony Romo is going to come back. Why? I mean, everything is going so well. Why, right? And so, and I know a lot of you have those fears too, but we wanted to get below the surface of those innate fears this morning. We wanted to get to those fears that are deeper. The fears that turn into anxieties in your life. The fears that keep you up at night. The fears that can paralyze you. The fears that sometimes cause you to make irrational decisions. And so we ask you to give us some of those fears, and you guys responded incredibly well. I just want to share with you some of the fears that are sitting in this room, because I would venture to guess that there's more of one of us in this room that shares these same fears. Just a couple off the top that I couldn't let go without mentioning. Somebody in here has a fear of long sermons. But you didn't qualify, so anything under an hour is short to me, okay? So this one really got me. Somebody in here has a fear of bald pastors. Ironically, I do as well. No, listen, here are some of your fears that are under the surface. Fear of failure. More specifically, a fear of not being good enough. Not being a good enough husband, a good enough wife, a good enough father, a good enough mother. I didn't have time to count up how many times these came up over and over and over, but I can assure you this is one of the greatest ones that occurred. Just not measuring up, not being good enough. There's a fear of rejection. A fear of abandonment, and with that, a fear of being alone. A fear of failing specifically at your business. A fear of addiction. And with that, a fear of losing your sobriety. A fear of your marriage failing or of divorce. A fear of not being able to provide for your family. A fear of your children not having a relationship with Jesus. A fear of something happening to your children. A fear of not having enough finances. a fear of being single for the rest of your life, a health fear, specifically getting cancer, a fear of not living the way God wants you to live, a fear of the unknown, and I can't count how many times this one showed up, a fear of the direction our country is headed. Just to get under the surface with some of my fears that are more than the innate fear of heights and water, and I have a fear that I don't always hear God correctly. So I think it's interesting that God put me in this place, in this calling where I'm called to lead, and sometimes I just fear that I miss hearing Him correctly. And so when we design sermon series or individual messages, and just, did I hear that right? I mean, there are times when I'm working and I'm like, God, surely not. Did I hear this right? The fear of just missing it when we lead new directions, bold directions, and go crazy places. I just want us to all be honest this morning about those fears that are very real, that can create anxiety, that can keep us up night, that can paralyze us, that can force us to make irrational decisions. And here's today's life lesson. Fear is absolutely necessary. Fear is absolutely necessary. Now, I know some of you may push back on that initially, but what we've been doing, like I said, is looking at the Israelites and their wandering in the wilderness. And this morning, we're going to specifically look in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Bible. Moses wrote it. Moses was the one who led the people through the wilderness and to the promised land, though he didn't get to see it himself. And when you look at Deuteronomy, sometimes you read Deuteronomy, if you've already read, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, you read Deuteronomy, you're like, I've already heard all this before. Because in Deuteronomy, what Moses is doing is he's like reflecting. He's journaling on the journey. He's reflecting on the things that happened. And one of the things that you see happen was they had a lot of fear in their 40 years of marching through the wilderness. They had fear of whether they would make it or not. They had fear of the people who were in the wilderness. I mean, they had to come up against people like the Moabites and the Amorites and the Hittites and the termites and all of these people that were in the wilderness. In fact, in Deuteronomy, it tells us that in the wilderness, there were venomous snakes and scorpions. Count me out. I don't want to be there, right? They had all of these fears that they had to go through. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses is chronicling all this, 35 different times you see some command related to fear. So I want to take us through a few of those this morning. If you got a Bible, that's great. You can turn to Deuteronomy. If not, just grab your phone and you can go there. I'm going to put these up on the screen as well. Not just one text, but just different places in the book of Deuteronomy where you see these places where fear is commanded. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask to you look for the pattern here, or the association or the correlation between all of these scripture verses, all right? So in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 21, here's what we see. It says, "See, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up, take possession as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has told you. Do not fear or be dismayed." If you go down to verse 29 in Deuteronomy chapter 1, it says, "Then I said to you, do not be in dread or afraid of them. The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight for you." Can you just underline that or highlight that in your Bible? You need to memorize this verse. Do not dread or be afraid of them. The God who goes before you will fight for you. Can you just take your fear right now, whatever fear it is, whether it's that thing that keeps you up at night, the thing that gives you anxiety, the thing that's making you make bad decisions, can you just put it in the blank of them and say, listen, I will not be afraid of them. I will not be afraid of it because the God who goes before me fights my battles. You just need to memorize that verse. Hang on to that. If you flip over to Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 2, it says, "But the Lord said to me, do not fear him. Fear him is King Og. They were about to take down him and all of his people. Do not fear him, for I have given him and all his people and his land into your hand. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, over in verse 22, it says, you shall not fear them. And here you see it again. You shall not fear them, for it is the Lord your God who fights for you. Do you see a commonality through those verses just so far in Deuteronomy? And if you look at all those verses, there's a command to not be afraid, right? To do not fear. Don't dread them. Don't have anxiety over them. Do not fear them. But then I want you to skip over to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and see if that pattern changes just a little bit. Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting in verse 1, here's what we read. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's son, by keeping all of his statutes and his commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, that your days may be long. Skip down to verse 13, still in chapter 6. It is the Lord your God you shall fear. Verse 24 in the same chapter. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes to fear the Lord your God, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as we are this day. It finds it so odd to me that in the first few chapters of Deuteronomy, all we hear is do not fear them, do not be afraid of him, do not dread this. And then we get over to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and Moses said, fear God. He says it 3 times in Deuteronomy chapter 6. In fact, of the 35 times in the book of Deuteronomy that a command about fear is given, 15 of those times it's the command to do not be afraid, do not dread, do not worry. The other remaining times in the book of Deuteronomy is to fear God, to fear the Lord. And I know what some of you are thinking because you're smart people. And so you're thinking, okay, but here's what you're going to tell us. You're going to tell us that the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, there's more than one word for fear. But in English, we only have one word for fear. So when these words get translated in English, it just comes out fear. I'm sorry, I'm not going to tell you that this morning. Because in the Hebrew, the word used for fear, when it says do not fear him, do not dread them, and fear God, it's the same exact word. Yahweh. The same word, but it does have a few different meanings. I mean, to fear cannot, or to not to fear can mean don't be afraid of, don't be scared of, do not dread. At the same time, the word fear can mean to be in awe of, or to respect, to revere. And I know you're really smart people, and so you're thinking, well, that's where we're going to go this morning. No, that's not where we're going to go either. Here's where I want to take us. What's the opposite of fear? I mean, you think about that, the opposite of fear. A lot of times we think the opposite of fear is, okay, if Ryan has a fear of heights, let's take him up to the highest place we can find and just hang him there until he gets over it. Right? Like soon enough, he'll muster enough courage to get over it. Okay? If that's you and you have a fear of clowns, what if I put you in a room with a whole bunch of clowns and just said, he'll get over it here after a while? Right? See, because oftentimes we think the opposite of fear is courage. If I have fear, I don't have enough courage in this area. So I just need to muster up enough courage and I can overcome that fear. But that's not the opposite of fear. The opposite of fear is trust. You see, it's not the heights that bother me. It's that I don't trust what's underneath me. Right? I have a fear of heights. The worst part of snow skiing is not tumbling down the mountain. It's riding up the lift. Right? When I go snow skiing, I'm on the lift, and there's that little pole in the middle. I'm hanging onto it for dear life. I trust the lift. I trust the seat. I don't trust what's beneath me. One time I was doing that, like I was in my 20s, I don't remember, and there was a little kid who was probably 5 sitting next to me, and he was wanting the pole, and I beat him off of it because I had to have the pole. Right? It's not water, it's that I don't trust what's in the water, especially if I can't see the bottom of it. right? With Tony Romo, it's not necessarily Tony Wright. It's like, I don't trust Jerry Jones. He's never given me any reason to trust him. You with me? See? It's trust. That's the opposite of fear. Let me read this to you again and see if it makes a little bit more sense to you. Verse 2, Deuteronomy 6. That you may trust the Lord your God. That you may trust the Lord your God. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13. It is the Lord your God you shall trust. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 24. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes to trust the Lord our God. Listen, today's life lesson is that fear is absolutely necessary. You will never conquer a fear. You will never get sleep at night. You will never get to that place where you don't dread, have anxiety, or make bad decisions, or become paralyzed by trying harder or having more courage. The only way you can overcome those fears is to have more trust in God. The only way you can get good rest at night is to know that God is a good God. The only way you can get into those places and not be paralyzed or make bad decisions is to have greater trust in God. You see, fear in God is absolutely necessary. Okay, well, if that's the case, how do I do that? How do I grow my fear of God? How do I grow my trust of God? The answer is in Deuteronomy chapter 6. If you keep reading in Deuteronomy chapter 6, go down to verse 4 with me. Here's what Moses said to the people. He said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontiers between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates." Here's what Moses is saying. If you want to grow in your trust of God, you've got to get to know Him better. If you want to grow in trusting God, you've got to get to know Him. You've got to know His Word. You've got to know what it says. You've got to put it in your heart. You've got to spend time with Him. You've got to get to know Him. My two boys are here this morning. They're 18 and 14 now, but when they were younger and we used to go to the swimming pool, or we used to go on vacation and we would be in a hotel and we would go to the pool. Keep in mind, I have a fear of, thank you. We would go to the pool, and so because of my fear, we would get in the pool and we would be at the 4-foot end. And I would stand in the water, and as they were beginning to swim and learning to swim and conquering their fear of the water, because I wanted them to conquer that fear, they would get on the edge of the pool, and they would want to jump into the water. Now, this was before they could even really swim good, so they would have floaties on, and all this kind of good stuff. And I would stand in the water, and I would ask them to jump to me. And they would do it. They would jump off the ledge of that pool and they would jump into my arms. Why? Because they knew me. They had a trust that I would catch them because they knew me. They weren't going to do that to a stranger because they didn't know the stranger. Okay? They weren't going to do that to someone they didn't trust. They were only going to jump into the arms of someone they knew well and that they trusted. And if we're going to grow in our trust with God, we've got to get to know Him better. We've got to be in His Word. We've got to be doing exactly what this says, that we talk about this when we sit down and when we get up, when we lie down and when we get up. Does it leave anything out? No. We've got to know Him. Listen, it's more than just coming to church 1 hour a week. You got to get to know Him. You got to be in His Word. You got to spend time praying. You got to be in community with other people where you can talk about your fears, where you can talk about life's events, where you can spend time with other people and they can stretch you and grow you and you can get to trust Him more. Listen, I'm telling you right now, I'm confessing to you this morning, I would not make it through this transition if it wasn't for my wife, good friends, and the staff here at Aldersgate. Because it's in community when we share these things together that I'm stretched, I'm grown. In fact, let me just give you something here this morning. Today's sermon wasn't an inspiration of mine. It was an inspiration of one of your staff members here at Aldersgate who said, here's what I see. I see fear. Right? It's in those times with other people that we begin to trust God even more. You've got to get to know Him. There's another thing. Deuteronomy chapter 6, if you'll skip down to verse 20 for me. Here's what Moses says. When your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? Here's the words. Here's what he's saying. When your son comes to you and wasn't alive for all of this, and he wants to know, why do we do this? Why do we celebrate these feasts? Why do we go to church? Why do we move the time? Why are we doing all of this? When that time comes, here's what you tell him. Verse 21. You shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us up out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from here that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give our fathers. Listen, here's what Moses is saying. He's saying, if you want to grow to trust God more, you need to remember how good he is. When fear comes knocking on your door, I don't care if it's a fear of being insignificant. I don't care if it's a fear of your marriage trembling. I don't care if it's a fear of you not having enough finances to make it. I don't care if it's a fear of your life not mattering. I don't care if it's a fear of what's happening in our country. I don't care if it's a fear of what's happening with your kids. When fear comes knocking on your door, you remember how good God has been to you. And when you remember how good God has been to you, suddenly you're reminded that you can trust him. I would encourage you to do this right now if you're dealing with a place of fear, if you're paralyzed, if it's become a place of anxiety in your life, if it's become a place where you're making irrational decisions. And I would encourage you to just get alone today with God. Get a pen and a piece of paper or get your tablet that you can type on and just spend some time listing all the ways God has been good to you. Just list all the ways God has been faithful to you. Remember the places where you were at previously and how God led you through those places and never left you, never forsake you, and he was just with you all the time. And some of you may be sitting here this morning going, I'm not there yet. I'm not okay that God let my spouse die. I'm not okay that God let my kids die. I'm not okay that my kids are still prodigals and they haven't returned home. I'm not okay that we're still here at All Saints. I'm not okay with the choices we have for President of the United States of America. Listen, I don't care if you're not there yet. In every situation, you can find God's good. In every situation, you can find God's good. And if you will get alone with him and sit down and try to begin to journal or write down those places where God has been good, your trust in him will grow. Remember me and the boys in the pool? Because I'm such a good dad, I would get in the pool and they would get on the edge of the pool and I would get really, really close to the edge until right before they jumped. And then I would take a step back. Because if I started here, they wouldn't jump. But if I started closer, they would jump. And I wasn't going to let them go under. I would catch them. Right? And man, they'd be so excited and they'd get out of the pool and they'd go to the side of the pool again. And man, I'd start right there where I caught them last time and they would begin to jump off. And right before they jumped, guess what I would do? I'd take another step back and encourage them to take another leap out. And they would do it. Why? Here's why they did it. Because the time before, I caught them. I didn't let them drown. And they remembered that when they got back to the edge of the pool, that even though I was standing out a little bit farther, I had caught them before. Why would I let them down now? That's exactly how it is with God. When he catches us in life one time, why would he not do it the next time? But oftentimes we forget that he caught us that one time. And if we want to grow in our trust in your place of fear, you have to remember how good God is to you. Remember Peter in the New Testament? Peter was one of the apostles, the original 12. There's a story in Matthew chapter 14 where Peter walked on water. As far as I know, there's only two people that have ever done that, Jesus and Peter. And there was a big storm, and Jesus was walking towards the disciples on the water, and Peter looked out and said, man, Jesus, if that's you, tell me, I want to walk out there to you. And Jesus said, come on. And Peter stepped outside the edge of the boat and he began to walk on water. And here's the story we usually get caught up in. The part of the story that we get caught up in is that Peter began to get focused on the storm around him, took his eyes off of Jesus, and he began to sink. And you may think, well, what's the good in that? Here's the good. Even in failure, Jesus reached out and grabbed him by the hand and pulled him up out of the water. In any situation in your life, you can find God's good. You've just got to look for it. And if you're struggling with fear, then I would encourage you to spend some time remembering how good and faithful God is. Just listen to this. Get to know God. This is what he says. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes before you. He will never leave you or forsake you. Psalm 27:1. The Lord is my light and salvation. Who shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? It reminds me of Paul in Romans 8:31, where he says, if God is for us, who can be against us? Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hand. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7 from the New Testament. Cast all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. I don't know what it is for you. It was completely anonymous this morning. I'll have no way of ever knowing this about you. I don't know if you have a fear of failure. I don't know that if you have a fear that your marriage is going to crumble. I don't know if you have a fear of becoming addicted or if you have a fear of losing your sobriety. I don't know if you have a fear of not being able to provide, not having enough finances. I don't know if you have a fear of being single for the rest of your life or if your health is going to fail. I don't know what it is for you, but here's what I know. Fear is absolutely necessary. A fear of God is absolutely necessary. And if you will grow in knowing God and remembering how good he is to you, your fears will shrink.